If I was being forced into picking a favorite movie of all time, I think I would probably pick the movie Gladiator. Which came out in 2000. If you're not familiar with the movie Gladiator, you need to find someplace online and watch it. Depending on the ages of your kids, probably not with them around. But it is an amazing movie. The thing that I think I like about it the most, there's a lot that I really like about it, but I think the thing I like about it the most is that it's epic. I mean, like in the most literal sense of the word, it is an epic movie. And the storyline is epic. The characters are epic. It's epic. And in my memory, it was probably the first movie of that kind that I ever watched. I think that's probably part of why it sticks in my gut, why I've always liked it so much. But I also like it a lot because I've always been very interested in epic kinds of stories. You know, big, grand stories with big, grand characters. They just have always captured me. There's a reason why those kind of stories are so popular and have been throughout human history. That's also one of the reasons why I like the Old Testament of the Bible. Especially as I've gotten older, I've come to deeply appreciate the epicness of many of the stories there. I've kind of always said that it'd be interesting to me if somebody decided that they wanted to take and make movies out of the Bible. And I'm not talking like the Noah movie that came out 10 years ago, not that. Like that movie is trash. And if you like it, I am not sorry that I just told you that movie is trash. It is rough. But like if somebody were to take certain sections of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, and not deviate from the stories, that was a big part of the problem with the Noah movie. If they just told the stories as they're told in the Bible, I mean, there are some unbelievably epic stories in there. And today we're going to look at one of those. Now, when I was planning out this message series, in summer, we do things a little bit differently here. During the rest of the year, we teach in message series where often the messages in the series all share a common theme or they kind of build on one another. There's something like that. In summer at City North, it's just one-off messages each week that doesn't really connect to anything else. They're just individual things. And when we were laying out the summer teaching calendar, I was like, man, I want to preach on Mount Carmel. Like it's an epic story. And so we're going to look at that today. We're going to jump into 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to jump in really quickly because we're going to cover a lot of scripture again today. Before we actually dig into what happens in 1 Kings 18, though, I want to give you some context and help you understand what has happened and led to this point in the story. And by the way, when I talk about the parts of the Bible that would be incredible movies like 1 and 2 Kings, they'd be good. So 1 Kings chapter 18. At this point in the Bible story, if you're not super familiar with the overall biblical narrative, at the very beginning of the Bible, God establishes a relationship with a special family. And he says, you're going to be my chosen people, you're going to be my chosen family, and I'm going to walk with you, I'm going to have a relationship with you, and the whole world is going to be blessed through you. You're going to be my representatives on the earth. And this family ends up becoming known as the nation of Israel. And at this point in the nation of Israel's history, there are two kingdoms. Rather than having one united kingdom, one nation of Israel, there are now two kingdoms. There's been a divide, there's been a split. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And in a very general sense, the northern kingdom is normally the bad kingdom, and the southern kingdom is normally the good kingdom. Our story takes place in the northern kingdom, under the reign of a king named Ahab. Now, Ahab, if you're familiar at all with the Old Testament, Ahab is pretty widely regarded as one of, if not the most wicked king in the history of the nation of Israel. He's not a good guy. And a lot of where he goes wrong is because he married a woman who was a princess in another kingdom named Jezebel. Now, if you've ever heard someone referred to as a Jezebel, that actually comes from this woman. So that should give you a little bit of a clue as to the type of person that Jezebel was. As a foreign princess, she brought to Israel with her the gods that her family and her nation worshipped. And there are two that you'll hear about later on, Baal and Asherah. What happened was as Jezebel brought these gods into the kingdom, into the nation of Israel, Ahab began to worship those gods, and then the nation of Israel as a whole began to worship those gods. And things just went badly. Now, it's in the midst of that we're introduced to a character named Elijah. Elijah's a prophet. So Elijah would receive messages from God and give them to the nation of Israel on God's behalf. And Elijah did not like Ahab, and Ahab did not like Elijah. A lot of it came down to the fact that at a certain point in time, God said to Elijah, I want you to prophesy over Israel that there's going to be a drought. And there's going to be a drought indefinitely until my people return to me and stop worshiping all these other foreign gods. So Elijah makes the prophecy comes true. Ahab's not happy about it because as the king of an agrarian culture, an agrarian society, a drought is a real bad thing. It means people can't make money. It means people are unhappy. And so everybody's unhappy with Ahab. Ahab turns his anger toward Elijah. And he decides that he's going to kill this prophet of God because if he kills Elijah, then everything's going to be taken care of. So Elijah goes into hiding. It's about 3 years after that Elijah runs into a man named Obadiah. Obadiah has worked his way up through Ahab's, through his ranks, and he's become a pretty high-ranking official in Israel. But unlike Ahab, Obadiah is a good man. So Elijah and Ahab run into each other, and Elijah says to Obadiah, I want you to go give a message to Ahab. Tell him that this thing's about to come to an end. I want to meet with him. And Obadiah's like, I can't go tell Ahab I saw you, because if I tell him I saw you, he's going to kill me for not killing you. So Elijah says, all right, well then we'll speed it up even more. You go give my message to Ahab and tell him to come meet me today. And we're going to pick up the story right there in 1 Kings chapter 18. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, you troubler of Israel? Elijah responds, I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands, and you have followed the Baals. Now, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So let's pause for a moment. One of the things that I love about Elijah is that Elijah, as was the case with most of the prophets in the Old Testament, was not afraid to stand up to the kings. They were not afraid to stand up to people in power and call out what was real and what was true. They weren't afraid to give messages from God, even when those messages would not have benefited them. And Elijah was certainly no exception. So Elijah goes and he says, bring everybody together. And to be very clear, when he says bring all the people of Israel, he probably meant the leaders from the different regions around Israel, not the entire nation. But he says, bring the prophets of Baal and bring the prophets of Asherah. And we're going to meet on this mountain. And something's going to happen. So as we pick up the story again, it says Ahab sent word throughout all Israel, and he assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people, and he said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Now, this is a major moment in the story. And it's a major moment because for the first time, Elijah addresses not just the king, but he addresses all the people, the leaders of all the tribes of Israel. And he tells them what's going on. He says, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? And it's that line that clues us into everything that is to come and helps us understand why this obscure story from 2,800 years ago matters. That line when he says, how long will you waver between two opinions? In the Hebrew, it can be literally translated, how long will you limp between two paths? Or how long will you limp between two roads? When my son Mason, who is now 8, was young, like probably 2 years old, like barely talking, he decided to pull this really fun stunt where when we would tell him to go upstairs to go to bed, his legs would stop working. And so if he was standing and we said go up and go to bed, he would just fall over in the middle of the floor. And he would kind of roll around and go, oh, my legs, they hurt. My leg. Now, what's funny is that Mason still does that a lot. Not that drastically, but so, and then we'd be like, all right, get up, go upstairs. So he'd go, and then he'd walk to the steps. And he'd kind of walk to the steps like this. And he'd get to the steps, and he'd step onto the first step, and his foot would slip, and he'd fall. And it was usually sometime around then that being a really good, empathetic father, I would say something along the lines of, I can make your legs not work. To be clear, I never made his legs not work. But buddy, I wanted to sometimes. Like we Your legs cannot work. That's an option here. The point is, he didn't want to go do what I asked him to do, or what Vanessa asked him to do. And so he would try to come up with a scenario where like he couldn't do it because his legs. How long will you limp between two paths? How long will you waste your time? How long? The idiom that we might use today that would be a very similar idiom to this is, how long are you going to sit on the fence? How long are you going to sit on the fence? How long are you going to be in one spot, not choosing between your two options? How long? How long will you waver between two paths? It's also interesting to me that the people respond with nothing. At this point in the history of the nation of Israel, they should have some level of conviction about who God is. The things, when you read from the beginning of the Bible up until this point in 1 Kings, the things that God has done in the nation of Israel are remarkable. And yet somehow, it's just like they've got nothing. They're so wishy-washy. They're so just stuck in the limping between the two paths that they have no response at all when Elijah calls them out for it. My suspicion, and what we see borne out later on in the story, it's not that they don't believe that God exists. It's not that Israel doesn't think that God is real. It's that they don't treat him like he's actually God. They know he's real, but they waver in their allegiance. Their attention is divided. Their focus wavers because they won't just give God authority. And so, as a solution to this problem, Elijah suggests a contest. Now, I'm going to read a significant amount of scripture here that isn't in your message notes today. I'm going to read everything that's between the two sections that are. So you're more than welcome to check that out on your own later on, but I'm going to read it. It'll be on the screen. So as the story continues in 1 Kings 18, verse 22, Elijah says to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Apparently the prophets of Asherah never showed up. Elijah says, go get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but do not set fire to it. He says, I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. And then all the people said, sounds like a plan. This is an interesting moment when you dig in just a little tiny bit to the background of this story. In Sidonian culture, which is where Jezebel was from, in Sidonian culture, the god that they referred to as Baal was the storm god. He was the god of lightning and of rain. Elijah was a smart dude. So when Elijah sets this test up, he doesn't just pick a random thing for the gods to battle it out with. He picks a test that for these people, they would have been like, oh, we've got this in the bag. Like, our God's the lightning God. He's got no problem bringing fire from the sky. He's got no problem holding the rain off. This is no problem at all. So Elijah sets up a loaded test. And he sets up the test very, very specifically. The people think it's a great idea. So Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, okay, choose one of the bulls. You have your pick. And you prepare it first, since there are so many of you. This is the first of, as a little bit of an aside, but I think sometimes we read the Bible in this really sterile way. Like, we read it like every character in it's like a church elder. You know what I mean? Like, they're like, yes, I love Jesus. Amen. And have a blessed day. And, it's like they're these Elijah's not that at all. I like Elijah because he's mouthy. And he likes to poke the bear. I find those kind of people fun, Aren't they fun? No. Just me? Okay. He's like, hey, you pick it first. Since there's like 450 of you and just one of me, you pick first. So, they do it. It says, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and they prepared it. Then They called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. And at noon, Elijah gets real fun. At noon, Elijah starts to taunt them. "Shout louder," he says. Surely he is a god after all, right? Oh, maybe he's thinking real hard. Maybe he's just busy. Oh, maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's taking a nap, and you just haven't yelled loud enough to wake him up yet. So they shouted louder, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. So this is kind of a gruesome scene, but this would have been right up the alley of these prophets in ancient Near Eastern Israel in 700-800 BC. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. So now Elijah, who's been sitting back and kind of biding his time all day long, just waiting. I mean, other than the taunting, which is fun. He's just been sitting back, like, all right. He stands up. Like, I have this image in my mind. Like, this is epic, right? Like, he stands up and he's like, all right, it's my turn. He says to all the people, "Come here." So they came to him. He repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. And Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." Now, real quick, for those who aren't familiar with it, Jacob is another name for Jacob was the birth name of the man that God renamed Israel. And Jacob had 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. So as Elijah does this, as he picks up these 12 stones, this is loaded in imagery that all of the people there would have understood, they would have gotten. It's another really epic moment. So he takes the stones and he builds an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. That would have been about 3 liters of volume. He arranged the wood. He cut the bowl into pieces and he laid it on the wood, which you would think would be the end of his preparation, but it was not, because he's about to start poking the bear again. Then Elijah says to them, "Hey, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering." Now, I don't know about you. As a general practice, I don't pour water over the thing that I'm about to try to light on fire. That's counterproductive. For those of you that are not pyros, like I am. It's counterproductive. If I'm going to light a fire, I want the dry wood, not wet wood. And I'm certainly not going to make the wood wet. It makes everything more difficult. Elijah's like, "Get 4 large jars. Let's get that water soaking wet." So they do it. And then Elijah says, "Do it again." And they did it again. And I don't know, for those of you that are imaginative, like if you have this scene in your mind, like I just have this image of Elijah standing there smirking, like this is about to be good. And then he says, "Do it a 3rd time." And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and it even filled the trench. So even as Elijah's building the altar and digging this trench out, come on, like the dude's thinking like, this is going to be great. I can't wait. I'm going to fill this. I'm going to put so much water on this thing that this whole trench is going to get filled up. Oh, it's going to be so good. Now we're going to pick back up in your message notes in verse 36. My guess is you know where this story's going. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate. They fell face down and they cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Now, the story continues from there, and it's pretty crazy. And if you'd like to see what else happens, you can read it starting in verse 40 on your own. It's worth a read. So God shows up in a huge way. God reminds Israel again who he is. Now, it's important to understand that all of this could have been avoided if Israel had not shifted their attention and their focus off of God. If Ahab, as the king of Israel, had not forgotten how good God had been and had not forgotten all that God had done and had kept his allegiance and his focus solely on God. All of this could have been avoided if Israel had not forsaken Yahweh and started sitting on a fence. But that's the important point of the story. In fact, I think, as I reflect on this story, that is the critical point of the story. I mean, growing up, I remember hearing this story, and it was always just kind of like, look how big and powerful God is. And that's true. Don't misunderstand. But the point of the story isn't just look how big and powerful God is. I mean, the Bible's full of look how big and powerful God is stuff. The point of the story is that God had to go to these lengths because as humans, we have this gravitational pull towards sitting on the fence. It's like it's built into us. It's like we can't help ourselves. When things are good, it's like, man, things are good. And if you grew up in church and ever did like teen camps and stuff, there's a bunch of different contexts you might have heard it in, but people talk about like, man, I like being on fire for God, right? You got to be on fire for God. But what happens? Like you go to some camp, you go to some retreat, you go to something, and you get all emotionally riled up, and that's not an inherently bad thing. But you're pumped for Jesus, and then you come home, and what happens? Real life, and it's like it just sucks the fire out of you. It's just gone, and you sit on the fence. The reality is, this story happened 2,800 years ago. The people are different. The places are different. The circumstances look different. But the underlying stuff that the people here did, that the nation of Israel did, it's the same stuff that you and I do all the time. We get comfortable. We get busy. We get distracted. We do our little hour thing here, hour and 15-minute thing here, and then we leave and we go to a restaurant. We get aggravated with the waiter or the waitress because are there good ones still? Like, did COVID kill good waiters and waitresses? I don't know what happened, but it's like, and you're aggravated with them, and like, why can't they just like come check for a refill? You know? And then you go home and there's somebody on their cell phone in front of you at the light. And you're like, I want to lay on the horn, but I got a Jesus fish on the back of my car, so I can't do that. Oh, no, they're in front. I can, okay. And then you get home and your kid's legs stop working when it's time for bed. And you're debating on whether or not you... Never mind, I'm not going to make that joke. Sorry. And by the time it gets time for bed, for a lot of us, like we haven't given another thought to God. Because our life just fills us up. And then Monday comes and you got to go to work and you got to battle rush hour traffic, and that's a fun thing. And then you go to work and you got to deal with your coworkers, you got to deal with your boss, you got to deal with all the stress and pressures and demands of the job, and you got to come home, and by the time you get home you're exhausted, and right, like life just moves and life never stops, and then before we know it, what happens? It's not that we don't believe in God, it's just that we don't even think about Him. We don't think about the things that He's done. We don't think about the ways that He is moving and active. We aren't tuned into His voice. We aren't hearing Him talk to us throughout the day, and we end up on a fence. Now, here's the fence that we end up on as people. And by the way, it's the same fence that they were on. As humans, what we love to do is make our lives the center of the universe. Because we're thinking constantly about how everything impacts us, how everything affects us. And when we do that, we make ourselves the center of our story. Jesus talked about this in Matthew chapter 7. Now, whenever I read the Bible, I like to practice when I read the Bible, I like to practice this thing that might sound a bit odd, but essentially what I do is I like to read a section of the Bible, and then I reread it, and then I'll reread it, and however many times I feel like I need to, and then I just like sit on it. I just wait. And sometimes I wait an hour, sometimes a day, sometimes a couple days, sometimes a couple weeks, and I'll just keep like looking at that. And I'll kind of keep asking, like, God, what are you showing me here? What are you wanting me to see? And eventually what'll happen is God will start to be like, hey, remember that part that's over here? Or remember that part that's over here? And he'll start to connect things for me. And it's very cool because what ends up happening is the Bible ends up showing me what the Bible is trying to show me in this place, but it shows me it over here. Like it's all just connected. As I was reflecting on and processing through this story, which again, like I knew going into the summer that I wanted to preach on this story just because I think it's epic and awesome. I kept just thinking, and eventually these words came to me that Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 7. Now, as I read these, I want you to understand that I think that this is one of the most challenging things that Jesus ever said, and one of the most challenging things in the whole of the Bible. Jesus said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." I'm going to read that one more time. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, for the people that Jesus spoke these words to, they would have immediately had images in their mind. These people lived in walled cities. The walls served a purpose: keep other people out. Well, the problem is if you wall your city off to keep other people out and you can't get out, that is also a problem, right? So all of these cities would have gates. And the main roads that would lead into town from maybe a couple different directions, there would be broad, wide roads, broad, wide gates. The gates probably would have been like decorative and opulent. The gates would have been intended to show off, like, look at us. Look at us. Look at the city that we've built. Look at what we've accomplished. Look at what we've done. In many ways, the gates would have been this image of we are going to make ourselves the center of this story. Look at our city. Look at our gates. Look how powerful. And Jesus says those gates, the wide gates, the gates that you can see when you're coming into the city from miles away, the gates that you can see there that everybody's going through, that gate, it just leads to destruction. Now, the majority of scholars think that Jesus is talking about the life beyond this life. They think Jesus is talking about heaven and hell. And that's certainly possible. It's also possible that Jesus is not just talking about heaven and hell, but he's talking about life here and now. It's entirely possible, I would say, in my mind, it's even likely that Jesus isn't just speaking of eternity, but he's speaking of now. He's saying there's a wide road and there's a wide gate that like everybody is on. But that road, it's just brokenness, it's destruction, it's pain, it's heartache, it's nothing good. But it looks good because it's the easy one to see and everybody's walking toward it. But there's another way. There's a way that is life. But that gate is small. The road to it is narrow. And not many people are going to find it. The reason why it's so challenging to me is because we like to think of following Jesus as really, really easy. We like the idea that because the reality is coming to Jesus is very easy, but following Jesus is not. We don't like that because we want things to work out for everybody and we want to empathize. We want people to be successful, and those are all good and noble things. But the truth is, not just here, but in many other places, Jesus talks about how it's not easy to follow me. It's hard. And it's hard because there's this really wide gate that looks really, really good and that everybody's on that road. But did you notice that Jesus said, small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it? Now, every once in a while, I will accident my way into finding a thing that I lost. The best one of these was in college. I lost my wallet in college. My mom's back there shaking her head and burying her head in her hands already because she knows exactly the story I'm talking about. I lost my wallet in college. I wish that I were exaggerating the rest of the details of this story, but I am not. I had no idea where my wallet was for like 3 or 4 solid months, like a whole semester. No clue. In retrospect, I don't really even know like how I survived. Like I don't remember how I bought gas or, like I don't know, but somehow I did. And it was not that my parents were giving me money. I promise you that. Wallet is gone. Okay. So, and I just never wanted to get around to like all the, I got to cancel the cards. I just want to deal with it. So I didn't. And the semester goes on. And it's like, where's your wallet? I have no idea. Like, and I went to school at a small private Christian college. Like if somebody would have found it, it would have made its way back to me. Doesn't happen. Finally, end of the semester comes and, packing up my room and getting everything ready to go home for the semester. And I'm cleaning out under my bed. Found that sucker about 6 inches from where my head was every night for 3 months. Straight under my ear. Now, listen, to my credit, I looked there about 14 times, and it wasn't there. It was absolutely not there. Somebody pulled a fast one on me and stuck it there right before I moved out. I'm convinced of that. Nothing anybody could ever say will convince me otherwise. It's rare to accident into finding a thing. Every now and then it happens. Last Christmas, my wife got me one of the best gifts that she's ever gotten me. She got me a bunch of those little tile things. Are you guys familiar with this? So on my keys, I have, I'm about to change some of your lives. I've got this little guy right here, okay? And that sucker's got Bluetooth built into it, and I've got an app on my phone. And I can say, find my keys, and it starts ringing. I've used it 3 times in the last 2 days. Also not a joke, sadly. I've got one on my keys. I've got one in my wallet. I've got one on our volume remote because for some reason, no one in our house can put our volume remote where it belongs. And we've got a sound bar, so we have a TV remote, right? But Dummy bought a sound bar that wasn't compatible with the TV remote, so we have to have the TV remote and the volume remote. So I got one on the volume remote. I don't remember where else. I've got them some other places too. Mostly I have to look for the things to find the things. Well, you know how you know what prevents me from being able to look for something? Sitting on a fence. I can't look if I'm sitting on a fence. I can't look if I'm sitting on the couch. My kids are wonderful at that move. Hey, did you look for it? Yeah. Did you move? No. You didn't look, right? If I'm trying to find the narrow gate and the narrow road, if I'm trying to find that because Jesus says I have to find it, I can't find it if I'm limping back and forth between 2 paths. I can't find that road if I'm sitting on a fence between 2 opinions, because when I'm sitting, I'm not moving. When the Israelites at Mount Carmel were confronted by Elijah, and when he said, stop wavering between 2 opinions, that's what's gotten you into trouble here. Jesus is getting at the same thing when he talks about the gates. Now, it may not look like it on the surface, but for many of us, we go through our lives days, sometimes weeks at a time, without ever prioritizing God. He's there, we believe in him. It's not that we don't believe in him, but we don't prioritize him. We aren't asking God, what do you want? And then committing, saying, whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want it, I will do it, no matter what. Rather, we're sitting on a fence because we've made ourselves the center. And we're saying, God, I don't know if I can do that one for you. Now, we don't say it that way because as soon as we say it that way, we know we're in trouble. We say it like this. We say, I don't know that that's really what God wants me to do. We say, I'm not sure if that's really the step he wants me to take. I got to be certain. Well, if we're certain, is it faith? Or is it certainty? We say, that thing though, that doesn't make sense to me. Why would God ask me to do something that doesn't make sense? Because that's what he does. To show us that we need him. Why would God ask Elijah to pour a bunch of water on top of the sacrifice? I don't know, maybe Elijah just thought it'd be fun. Narrow is the road. Small is the gate, and few find it. We like to think it's easy to follow Jesus, but the truth is it's difficult. It's difficult because following Jesus involves doing things God's way no matter what, not wavering between two opinions. It's difficult because, like Israel, we are surrounded by people and by a culture that celebrates putting humanity at the center of our stories instead of putting God at the center. And so we end up putting ourselves in the center, when the truth is God won't take any place except the center. So like Israel, we wind up apathetic, wavering between two opinions and sitting on the fence. The truth is we can't find the small, narrow gate when we're on the fence. We can only find the small, narrow gate when we're up, when we're moving, when we're actively searching and looking, because it's hard to find. And it's hard to find because we like to be the center. And so if I could summarize it all, what I would say is that we can't follow Jesus when we're sitting on a fence. We can't. That's what Israel got wrong 2,800 years ago. That's what Jesus was getting at when he talked about the wide and the narrow gates. Look, my hope as a pastor is that every person that ever steps foot in our church will find the narrow gate. My hope as a Christian, as just a Christian human, is that every person on earth will find the small and the narrow gate. But according to Jesus, they won't. And that doesn't mean we stop trying. It doesn't mean we give up. But it does mean that as Christian people, it is our job, it is our imperative, it is our call to search for the gate and to make sure we don't get stuck sitting on a fence, because life is good at just dragging us back there and dragging us back there and dragging us back there. It's our job to get off the fence, to choose. I'm reminded of the words of Joshua when he says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." It's up to us to choose which side of the fence we're going to be on. It's up to us to choose how it is that we're going to live our lives. Saying to God, whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, I will follow you. Or saying, but wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and narrow is the gate that leads to life. My hope, my prayer for all of us, every one of us, is that God will make it very clear to us if there are ways in our lives that we're sitting on a fence. If there are areas in our lives where we need to get off the fence and where we need to pursue him more. If there are areas in our life where apathy has taken over, where busyness has taken over, where stress has taken over, and maybe we don't even know that we're sitting on a fence because that's just the pull of humanity. And most of all, my hope and my prayer is that for every one of us, any places, any areas in our lives where we are making ourselves the center of the story, that God would help break down the walls that keep us there and get us off the fence, because there's a way that leads to life. Let me pray for us.